you have been diagnosed with any form of autoimmune disease or chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, it's pretty much a guaranteed mold diagnosis, in my opinion. So if you have fibromyalgia as a diagnosis, then you also are in mold. And if you have chronic fatigue syndrome as a diagnosis, then you also are in mold.
Welcome to the Inspired Living with Autoimmunity podcast, the podcast for high achievers who want to stay sharp, focused, and full of energy despite their diagnosis. With your host, National Board Certified Functional Medicine Health Coach, Julie Michelson, where Julie helps you take your power back from autoimmunity. And now here's your host, Julie Michelson.
Welcome back to the Inspired Living with Autoimmunity podcast. I'm your host, Julie Houghton. And today I'm joined by Dr. Peter Osborne, also known as the Gluten Free Warrior, to talk about something that could very well be the cause of your chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, or other autoimmune symptoms that just won't go away. Trust me when I say this conversation could literally save your life if you suffer from chronic fatigue. Dr. Osborne, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am so excited for this conversation because you have been just shouting from the rooftops things that people with autoimmunity need to hear. And I know we both know wellness is wellness. And so I know you do more than just autoimmunity. But I would love to know how you got into this world of functional medicine, how you became such a voice in, the concerns around gluten and nutrition can you share your journey a little bit with us?
Yeah, sure. I was actually originally training in the VA in Houston. I was doing an internship in rheumatology there. And they gave us this big, thick book on the first day of the internship. It's called the Primer on Rheumatic Disease, and said, if you don't read it, don't come back. And that was on a Friday. And so you imagine, you go home over the weekend and, that's what you're doing this weekend. So I think I took copious notes. I'm a voracious reader, so I like to learn. So when I came back on Monday and I just sat into the internship and just watched, I just observed, right? I observed the attending docs and how they would question patients and treat patients and what they were doing. And so after a couple of weeks, I was really confused. And one of my first questions was, why did you ask us to read the book? Because you're not doing the things in the book. You're not actually pursuing some of the things that the book taught me, right? So the book talked about triggers for autoimmune disease, and you're not looking at triggers at all. You're just treating symptoms. So, if you had a diagnosis of RA, for example, they give methotrexate or Plaquenil. Lupus, ankylosing spondylitis, really didn't matter what neurological diagnosis they gave. It was really the same handful of what are called DMARDs, disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs. So I'm like, if we're not going to look for why they're sick and we're just going to medicate them, why read anything? And I didn't say it like that. I was respectful.
Sure.
But that was what I was thinking in my mind is like, why are we doing this? And what the book taught me, and this is not me, I didn't figure this out, but the book just kept going back to, depending on which disease you were reading about, like as an example, multiple sclerosis, there's tremendous research on pesticide exposure, right? So as a trigger, and like these people that have this disease have this as a historical background trigger, and heavy metals were triggers. And there were research studies on rheumatoid arthritis being triggered by gluten and being very common in people that have celiac disease. And so I'm like, why are we measuring for, triggers? To me, it makes sense to just measure for triggers. And so what I just succinctly did that the book didn't do, the book talked about a lot of different types of triggers depending on the autoimmune disease, but there was a pattern there. And so the pattern for me was the triggers very commonly categorically are food, chemicals, microbes, and nutritional deficit as being things we can measure, right? And so I just begged the doctors, let me take some people aside, let me measure these things and let's see how they respond and let's compare outcomes. And I was told no multiple times.
We don't do that here.
So I just kept going back to the library at Jesse Jones, the medical library in Houston, and I just kept basically drawing research out on, it started with gluten, look at all the connections between gluten and RA, look at all the connections between gluten and autoimmune, period. Why aren't we testing for that? Let's just try that. And I brought stacks of literature to my attending and he said, no, we're not going to do that. And then I went back and said, okay, well, what about fish oil? We can treat patients' pain with fish oil. I mean, look, comparatively to NSAIDs, it works just as well. Why would we want to damage their gut when we're treating them with NSAIDs when we have another option? No, we're not going to do that. And then I went back again and I pulled the literature on fasting. And I'm like, look, patients with rheumatological disease have less pain in like 48 hours just by not eating. What does that tell us? Maybe it's something in the food. It's not rocket science. And I was told again, no, we're not.
Oh, they must have hated you.
I think toward the end, they didn't like me very much. After leaving the VA in frustration and I started my own practice, one of my first private practice patients was a little girl, 9-year-old little girl named Ginger. And she came to me because for 7 years she had been being medicated. She'd been diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis at the age of 2. And so for 7 years, they had this little 2-year-old from 2 to 9 on methotrexate. Imagine a cancer medication for 7 years of your life, right? And then at
As
age
you're
9
developing, like,
yeah, as you're developing.
huh,
She had a permanent port embedded because of pain. She was in and out of the hospital so frequently for pain management. And, at 9 years old, the rheumatologist looks at the little girl's mother and says, she's going to die. You got maybe 6 months, go home and get your affairs in order.
goodness.
And so when she brought her daughter into me, she was crying and just, it was total desperation, right?
Sure.
I think it was a God thing. I think God sent them there and prepared me for this. And so what happened was she was allergic to blueberries and she was gluten sensitive and we changed her diet and she had some nutritional deficiencies, vitamin D and C and some other things. And once we did that, the port came out within 6 months.
Yeah.
Medication we were able to peel her back off medication. And within a year, she was in relative remission. And that was over 20 years ago. She's still alive. She didn't
Thank
die.
goodness. Yeah.
She went on and, went to school and graduated college. And now she's out in the world, having a life. And that was really my first endeavor into this realm of gluten sensitivity and autoimmune disease. And, it was because of that experience that I started Gluten Free Society as a foundation to raise awareness about the impact of gluten on autoimmune disease, not just celiac disease, but all forms of autoimmune disease. And that's why I wrote No Grain, No Pain. And so that was it. That was the story that started it for me. It was just that experience both at the VA and with that young lady.
Amazing. And I can't, as somebody who was treated for RA for over a decade, I just can't even imagine it with somebody so young and just, what that family went through with, what Ginger went through, but also what the family went through. I remember being diagnosed and basically, told the same thing, like, you're going to decline till you die, right? We'll try to slow it down as much as we can. At the time, as a mom with young kids, that was devastating. So I can't even imagine being a parent, basically being told the same thing about your child. And I just remember asking some of the same questions as a patient, right? Like, well, what about gluten? What about this? What, read about that and was mostly told poo-pooed. And I am one of those people, even though the RA was diagnosed first, I had undiagnosed celiac. I had no idea. Right. So I love that you've really kind of carried that flag of, getting that information into people's hands. And I, for one, am glad you had to read that book when you were at the VA, because obviously nobody was using the information, at least, in that system of rheumatology. Unfortunately, the story isn't that much different now as far as treatment approach, if you could even call it that, in the classic Western rheumatological system. And so listeners know my position on gluten. I have pretty much a hard line. Like, if you have autoimmunity, it's not going to be your friend, period.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's not just one driver, and it's never one driver even for one person, right? And so I would love to explore kind of the evolution of as you've been practicing this way, that, I know one of the things that you're focused on as well is truly educating people about the role that mold toxicity can play with driving chronic illness and autoimmunity. And I really want to kind of talk about that overlap because people tend to think when they hear mold, they think, black mold on walls that they can see, or you know what I mean? Like I think we get this picture in our head. But I kind of, to me, directly connects to your book, No Grain, No Pain, because I don't think people realize how much mold is in our food system.
Yeah, I mean, mold is the way it's stored, the way it's produced, it's commonly contaminating grains. I think a last major study on this found it's between 20 and 30% of the world's, grain crop is contaminated with mold. So it's a major problem. That's why you have, a lot of companies and a lot of governments require testing on a lot of these crops to try to reduce or minimize mycotoxins, which are the toxin derivatives of mold, right? Not quite the same thing, but they're the derivatives of mold. So, for example, black mold produces a type of toxin called trichotillin, and Aspergillus mold can create several types of toxins like gliotoxin and ochratoxin. So it's those things that can be present in grains that can also drive illness, not just environmental mold. It's both. But from what I see in my own clinic, most of the people nowadays that have been practicing 25 years, they're coming to me. They've already read my book. They're already grain free. Now they're still struggling and they don't know why. And part of the reason why is because they're being exposed environmentally to mold, which is not quite the same thing, right? So you have food-based molds, commonly grains, commonly coffee, sugar processed, ultra processed foods are contaminated with mycotoxins. It's a frequent problem. Those are some of the main things. And then of course, any alcohol is going to be contaminated with mycotoxins, any form of, especially fermented like wines and beer, ciders, that kind of thing. But for the vast majority of autoimmunity that we see when people have changed their diets and their problem and they're still struggling, we find a lot of environmental mold exposure.
Wow.
Mhm.
And again, it is back to the not necessarily visible, right? Like I know it's humid where you are. I live in Colorado, and 20 years ago, 22 years ago when we moved here, we were told, "Oh, there is no mold here. It's so dry." So not true. But how do you is it tested? Like what is your approach with you already clarified like you're specifically giving the example of people who've already made the changes, right? They're already grain free. They're maybe their nutrient levels are supported, but the needle's not moving. Are you just relying on testing? Is it history? How are you looking under the hood?
Always all of the above, right? There's no
Yeah,
one test that's come, you know, 100% foolproof, right?
sure.
Lab technologies are great. They're great guides. And I do use them. I believe in testing, not guessing. But part of not guessing too is a great history. Somebody says I had 2 roof leaks in a 5-year span. That's like an important piece of the puzzle. If somebody says, when I walk in my laundry room, it smells like must, that's also an important piece. So part of it is history taking. You probe properly and sometimes you'll find evidence of either water damage to a person's home or office building or vehicle, because those are the 3 common places we're going to find it. And so you just have to ask the right questions. And then secondarily, symptoms, that's also history taking. What kinds of symptoms are these people presenting with? Because mold very, very commonly represents a symptom pattern around neurological toxicity. So, chronic fatigue syndrome, brain fog, neuropathy, migraine headaches, burning tongue syndrome or scalding mouth syndrome can be a manifestation. Loss of vision or visual disturbance is a common manifestation. Oftentimes, these people are having random fevers. for no obvious reason. They're having systemic skin rashes that come and go without obvious reason, a lot of joint pain without injury or trauma. So just kind of spontaneous aches and pains. They really, really struggle to get out of bed. They're tired all the time. And so they just have these patterns, right, of symptoms. And then when you see that kind of pattern and they're non-diet responsive or non-nutrition responsive, now you have the history, you have the symptoms. Let's corroborate. The next step would be to corroborate objective data. Do they have evidence of mold allergy? So you can measure immune responses to mold as an allergy, which isn't the same thing as mold toxicity.
Right.
You can also measure mold toxins. Urine testing can be very valuable in that regard. You can measure antibodies to mycotoxins. You can also measure a number of different inflammatory mediators or markers that can signify potential for mold. One of the cheapest markers that I see most frequently that any doctor can order is ferritin. Ferritin is oftentimes used as a marker for iron status or storage, but if ferritin's elevated at high levels, it's an acute phase protein, so it's an indicator for inflammation, and I probably see it in 80 to 90% of people who have mold exposure. So it's one of those screening tools too. Sometimes just on basic blood work and you're running into ferritin being elevated, now you have at least an insight or a clue that, hey, maybe that's part of the problem, and you can inspect or investigate a little deeper. There's other markers, TGF-beta1 and MSH are markers, MMP9 is a marker. So there's just a variety of different markers. I'm more in the camp of, I like to measure as much objectively the actual exposure to the thing I'm suspecting than looking at some generic marker that could mean something, right? It's like,
Sure.
driveway's wet, maybe it rained, but maybe somebody washed their car, maybe the hose was on, or maybe the sprinklers turned on. There's multiple possibilities, right? So with mold, it's just is more as I can be specific. I try to gravitate in that direction. And once we find hard objective evidence, then we can prompt an inspection. A mold inspection of a person's home, can be costly if it's done well.
Yeah.
So you always want to go in with, evidence that says we need to justify this, right? I don't want to just, cause a person much money, right? So
Yeah.
when we have enough data, then now it's just a matter of a good inspection. And look, mold inspectors are like doctors. There's good ones, there's bad ones.
Sure.
There's ones that don't understand mold, even though they're inspectors. Just like there's doctors who don't understand mold, right? So an air test is not a mold inspection. And I think that's one of the most important messages anyone suspecting mold could walk away from this interview with, is if you think that because you've had an air test of your house that didn't show mold spores, that you're in a mold-free home, you're sorely mistaken. Air test is one of the most inaccurate, misrepresentative, and misleading types of testing you can do to assess mold in a home. It's not to say that you can't find it, but you can oftentimes not find it. And
Sure.
Even the WHO, the World Health Organization, if you look at their guide on dampness, their recommendation for air testing is that a minimum of 27 air tests are required to assess indoor airspace. So most mold inspectors do one or two, and then they do a comparative. And so it's a far cry from 27. But there's other tools. You can do an air test. There's wall cavity sample testing that can sometimes be more accurate. A good mold inspector will look at the air conditioning system. They'll look at the plenum. They'll look at the coils, because sometimes you see microbial growth directly. A good inspector will have an infrared camera where they can detect potential for massive temperature variances that might lead to condensation. They'll have humidity readers or hygrometers that they use as tools. They'll understand construction well enough to see defects that might lead to moisture or condensation. They'll do a visual inspection of the home and outside of the home. They may do some air testing. They can do cultures where they swab surface areas to determine whether or not there's mold spores or species that aren't being seen with the naked eye because they're microscopic at first.
Right.
And if they do find what they find looks like microbial growth, they can directly sample that with tape lifts or swabs. So it's a comprehensive approach, right? And it's just like with anything else. And if they're doing all those right things and they're coming to some kind of conclusion where they find it, then now their job is to assess why it grew. That's step 2 in the process, because if you know that it's there, you can remove it, but if the reason that it's there isn't fixed, it'll just grow back.
It's just like the health, like our
That's it.
bodies, right? Like
That's
if we
it.
don't
That's it.
address how we got here. And I love if somebody, hires someone to come do an inspection and they're in and out of your house in 20 minutes, half hour, you did not get a mold inspection. Like it is a complex, it should take some time. And like you said, they should be going everywhere. It shouldn't just be a quick in and out.
Yeah, 2 to 4 hours is a reasonable, depending on the size of your house and the nature of things, but that's pretty typical for a good mold assessor to that's about how much time they'll need. So it's comprehensive. This and that's why it'll cost a little bit more than those guys that come out for 20 minutes and do an air
Yeah.
test, right?
Yeah. I know, which like you said, it may seem more cost effective, but if you're missing, then you're missing the whole point. It ends up biting you in the end.
Well, you end up
Um,
spending the money on a good one if you
yeah,
get a bad one, right?
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, and if it's not mold, you can move on and you can really feel confident that you ruled it out. But if you've had an air test and it was normal, don't dismiss it as a potential, especially if your testing through your doctor's office shows a bunch of objective findings that point to mold as part of what's driving the illness.
Yeah. And I imagine because we're talking about this today, that this is a more common contributor than people typically think. Like I think a lot of people have now bought into, diet and some other lifestyle components and contributors. But do you see this as a really pretty common driver?
Extremely common, much more common than we originally thought. I mean, just according to EPA data, if you look at the pooled data of many research studies, the prevalence of water damage in buildings of our infrastructure just in the US is at least half.
Yeah.
In Europe, it's just as bad. A lot of people think that because they have better construction techniques over there, they have less preponderancy to mold, and that's not true. Maybe 5 or 10% less, but not a significant amount. It's still a problem there. And it has to do with aging infrastructure. Yes, construction matters and the techniques of construction, but look, when you build a home, when you build a building, it's subjected to weather and aging and,
Yeah.
leaks and problems. And big part of it is the maintenance. And the way people flip homes and move from home to home, and you've got 25 people lived in a house that's only, 10 years old. How many spills, how many problems occurred in that house that didn't really get fixed right? And,
Right.
so homes break. And I think it's important for people to realize that just because you've had it put together, doesn't mean that it can't develop a leak or can't develop a problem. And then, even beyond the breakage aspect, homes oftentimes are built incorrectly. And that's really the bigger crux of the problem today because, the vast majority of builders, what do? They want cheap labor, right? They want
Yeah.
maximum profits and they want cheap labor. So what do? They hire illegals. And so then illegals who don't have a skill set, they know how to do certain things, but they skimp guidelines and they in an attempt to build it faster, they make mistakes. And some of these mistakes can be catastrophic to the health of your family and to the health of yourself. And, considering that most people's number one investment is their home,
Yeah.
you better make damn sure that it's built properly and you better take an interest in it and not just assume.
Yeah.
In this day and age, I just don't recommend that anyone buy a home, whether used or new, without having a mold inspection first, like separate from a building inspection. Building inspectors are not trained to sniff out mold. If you want to protect your investment and protect yourself, have a mold inspection before you sign the dotted line and invest all that money into a home and get into a home that's safe.
I think it's brilliant advice. It used to be, we used to think, well, it was an older home problem, right? Like you mentioned, aging infrastructure is part of the process, but even with new construction, for all those reasons you just mentioned, and just simply, you know, was the lumber dried out? Like the house was framed. Did it sit in the rain? And again, back to the right way to do things. And the newer homes are, better for energy, right? So they're a little more airtight. So when you're growing mold in your home, the homes just don't breathe like they used to, which can be a positive, but it's also something we need to be aware of. And so I think that that's a really big piece that people tend to overlook is, they think, well, it's a new home, so I can't have mold.
It only takes 48 hours for it to grow.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an entire brand new base in Florida, a military base that is riddled with mold because they didn't install water vapor barriers properly or even at all. There's a major lawsuit getting ready to happen. Um, if you've looked or paid attention, I mean, this was, I think last year, it was Rolling Stone published a piece on the mold problem in the military housing. A lot of
Yeah.
people don't realize military housing outsourced. They contractually gave 50-year contracts to third party, um, I call them poverty pimps because they're unethical companies that have been, awarded these massive financially incentivized contracts to maintain military housing and build military housing, and they're doing it wrong, and our soldiers are sick, very, very sick, and it's not a small amount. It's in many, many bases across the country, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But if you've seen the commercials for Camp Lejeune and you've seen recent here, I'm in Texas, we've had recent lawsuits where multi-million-dollar settlements have come out of bases in San Antonio at Lackland Air Force Base and,
Yeah.
at the Army base there, the Army. So, it's I mean, it's not just a military problem, it's a construction problem. We have,
Right.
we we have a wide scope of this, and I think it's the next step. Well, it's not the next epidemic, it is epidemic already. Actually, pandemic would probably be a better word, but, um if you don't have a water plan, if you don't have a mold inspection plan around your house or a maintenance plan around preventing mold, it can happen to anyone. And the problem with mold is this, I lost a house to mold. And one of the reasons I know so much about it is, it almost killed my wife. It did kill my dog.
Wow.
Made my son extremely sick. It made me sick. We almost lost everything. We lost everything. We lost our physically, we lost all of our possessions, because our house was so bad. It was 2 years old that, we had to walk away from it. We had to walk away and rebuild and tear it down. And, so that part of that journey was me wanting to understand why, because I didn't want to,
Yeah.
I didn't jump out of one home into another home and have a similar problem.
Right.
And so I hired a bunch of forensic guys to come out. I hired architects and engineers, and I hired HVAC experts, and I had them deconstruct why my house grew mold in the first place. And in my case, it was very unique because it's an interesting story. I was praying to God. This is years ago. I was seeing a lot of mold in my office in my practice, and I don't like to see mold. And the reason why it's a tough conversation, right? Imagine being the
Yeah.
doctor that says, "Mr. Jones, your wife is dying and it's mold." And Mr. Jones is a skeptic and he says, "Well, why am I not sick?" And I'm like, "Well, you work 16 hours a day and you're not in the house as much, and your
Right.
wife is, and now your wife is smaller and she's also more susceptible genetically, and there's all these other factors, right?
Sure.
Um, but you are sick. You're just dismissing your illness. You're just stoically pushing through what you say, "Oh, I'm perfectly healthy except for, these aches and pains that I have that,
Yeah.
you know." So there's that conversation where you have to tell somebody their house is either responsible for deteriorating their health. And of course, that's an expensive conversation.
Yeah.
A lot of people want to put their head in the sand and just keep going and ignore that conversation. So it's just a tough one to have. And I was having 10 of these conversations a week. And I'm the kind of doctor, I look at myself, I'm pretty empathetic. I take my work home with me when somebody's sick and they've trusted me to help them. I carry that
Sure.
weight. And anyway, when they're not getting out of it, that weighs and weighs and weighs and weighs on you, and they're getting, especially if they're getting sicker and they're struggling and they're not listening. So I was praying to God. I said, please, Lord, quit sending me chronic mold cases.
Terrible.
Please send me, please send me instead, the traditional cases where people respond tremendously well with their diet change and it's, relatively easy, and let me live out the rest of my
Easy street.
yeah, my practice in on Easy Street. And anyway, my answer was pretty clear. God gave mold to me, and he gave it to me in every way you could give it. I mean, he made everyone sick.
Yeah.
And he
It's like a
also,
parent praying for patience.
you know,
Don't do it. Yeah.
but he also gave me every forensic problem you could have. So like we had in our house, for example, the vapor barrier was installed improperly. So our foundation was part of the problem. The brickwork was laid improperly, so our brickwork was part of the problem. The vapor barrier was installed improperly, so that was part of our problem. The HVAC system was installed improperly, so that was part of our problem. The roof ridge vents in the attic were and not adequate at all, and that was part of the problem. So we had a dozen or more. Like the inspectors that we hired said your house was built with good material. It's just that it was built so wrong in so many ways. It was a death by a thousand cuts. There's no way it could control the moisture. And so mold was able to just spontaneously grow behind our wall cavity. And it wasn't a visible, obvious mold growth. It wasn't like, oh, there it is. It's on the bathroom wall. It was
Right.
actually, you had to tap the wall cavity and you had to look at the back of the sheetrock. And on the back of the sheetrock, you could see fractal patterns of mold growth, with the right lighting. It's called a flashlight test, and a good mold inspector understands how to do that, where they would shine a high-powered LED light at the right angle, you can see it growing. Um, so that was my answer. That's how I really said, "Okay, I can't retire, and I can't seeing these people, so I better understand it better so that I
Yeah.
can be of better use to them, of better service." And so that's why I'm out advocating about it. It's why we're creating a documentary series on it, because it's such a vast topic. It's such a problem, and it's so underrecognized. And I think if you're struggling watching this and you have been diagnosed with any form of autoimmune disease or chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, those are two big ones. That's pretty much a guaranteed mold diagnosis, in my opinion. There's a term called pathognomonic, meaning that if X is true, then Y is true, right? So if you have fibromyalgia as a diagnosis, then you also are in mold. And if you have chronic fatigue syndrome as a diagnosis, then you also are in mold, pathognomonic, right? So if you're watching this and this is the first time you're hearing it, welcome. Welcome to the world of mold. And I hope you take this information seriously and investigate it, because it could save your life. I know my wife almost died. As I said, she was on the couch most days in the depth of our mold exposure. And I would come home from work, and of course I work 12 plus hours a day. So I was the least affected of my family. But in her case, I was really frustrated, because I would come home and she would be lying down and she was tired all the time. And you can imagine how that would affect a relationship. And, I would try to have a conversation with her, and her words were so foggy, her head was so foggy
Yeah.
that she she wouldn't be able to finish the sentence, and I would be, like, anticipating and trying to finish the sentence for her, and, of course, it wasn't her fault, and, I was frustrated not necessarily with her, but I was just frustrated, and,
Sure.
you know, by the by the end of it all, she came to me. This was after we moved out, because when we got the forensic inspection done, we walked out of the house that day,
Wow. Yeah.
um, and we went to a hotel, and for 2 months, we stayed in an extended stay hotel to try to recover. And when she got her brain back, one of the things she shared with me that I never knew, before, was she said, "I didn't wanna live. I didn't wanna kill myself, but," she
Right.
says, "I just imagined walking out in the yard and if I had a pistol, just ending it all, not because I wanna die, but because I just don't wanna keep living." There was just lack of a lack of desire to wanna live that way and feel that way. And then after she shared that with me, my son shared the same thing with me. He felt the same way. I mean, mold creates a cloud, and
Yeah.
it can wreck your life if you let it, if you're not aware that it's even there. And I would just encourage any of you that are struggling and you don't know why, and your diet's clean, please, please, please look at mold as the next potential, for what might be behind your health ailments.
Yeah. So important. And I want to highlight we're still in a place as widespread as this impact is for people. Um, it is very likely that somebody might listen to this and then go ask their PCP, "Hey, do you think, mold could be my problem?" And I think we're still at that point where a lot of providers are going to say, "No, it's not really a real problem." Are you seeing a tipping point, or is that
No.
a fair warning for people that
Yeah. You
I'm talking about in the traditional Western medicine system?
So in the traditional system, so we're shooting a documentary right now on mold. It's called Mold Jacked. If you want to learn more about it, you can go to moldjacked.com. But I've interviewed 40 hours worth some of the world's leading practitioners on environmental medicine and mold exposure. And the number one question I asked them all is, what kind of training in medical school did you receive for mold literacy and mold illness? And the answer for every single one of them was, we didn't receive training.
Yeah.
And if you look at the position of uh, the main organizations like the immunology groups, their belief is that mold is not a problem unless you have an allergy to mold. And so I think it's important that people watching, I'm glad you brought this up, because there's three ways mold can affect you, three broad ways. Number one, yes, you can be allergic to mold. And when we think about allergy, we generally tend to dismiss that as not a big deal, right? Like, take some Claritin or take some, Benadryl and get over it. Mold allergy is estimated to be about 30% of the population. So if you look at the research, the statistical data on millions and millions of patients, says that it's about 30% of the population is allergic to at least one type of mold. Beyond that, so there's, mold allergy, how could that impact a person? Well, it can cause histamine release, and that it could contribute to elevated histamine responses and ultimately mast cell activation syndrome, which is not a fun disease to live with. But allergies can also weaken your immune system and make you more susceptible to things like asthma. And if we look at asthma rates and mortality rates from asthma, it's sky high. And we estimate that 40 to 50% of all cases of asthma are actually mold induced. So it's not a small thing to be allergic to mold. It's a big thing, and it has big ramifications. But that's just one aspect of mold. The second aspect of mold is something called mycotoxicosis. And actually, mycotoxicosis is just a fancy way of saying that the toxins that molds produce,
Yeah.
that penetrate and permeate into your air, you can breathe them in, you can absorb them through your mucous membranes. Those toxins, and there's a large representation of, we know of hundreds of these, and then there's many that we can measure and many that we can't. But these toxins, if we look at kind of the basis for how they do damage, they're free radicals. If I simplify it, they're free radicals. They rip apart your cells. And one of the hallmarks of mold exposure is the inhibition of DNA, RNA, and protein synthesis in the human body. So what that means is you don't heal very well. You age faster, right? Mold toxicity in this regard, mold toxin toxicity acts as an age accelerator that mimics radiation, slow poison radiation exposure, right?
Yeah.
And then beyond that, so you got mold toxins that are just damaging to all humans. They don't spare anyone. Okay. And then you have what's called mold colonization. Well, one of the side effects of mold, where do antibiotics come from, right? They come from mold toxins. Penicillin is a mold toxin.
Right.
And so imagine you're living in an environment where you're breathing in aerosolized mold toxins that act like antibiotics. So
Yeah.
what happens is you wipe out your flora,
Yeah.
your microbiome, and now you become colonized by mold. When your immune system, and big part of your immune system is your flora, when it's suppressed, you can now be susceptible to the mold growing on you or in you. This is one of the reasons we'll see in people that are living in mold, toenail fungus.
Yeah.
And it won't go away. And they're like, I don't know why I have this toenail fungus. You might be in mold. We see very commonly chronic sinusitis, where
Yeah.
there's a mold growing in their sinus cavity. And if you culture them, and most doctors don't do cultures anymore, it's an art that medicine should do, but many don't. you'll find aspergillus and other forms of mold in people's sinuses. It's actually one of the most common causes of chronic recurring sinusitis. So mold can colonize your body and cause mold infection, right? Mycosis is what the formal name for that is. So you have mold allergy, you have mycotoxicosis, and you have mycosis, right? So those three things, and then there's additional things too. So there's other researchers that are studying some of the other things that molds can produce. So one of the thoughts is as the mold is eating your home, it's digesting the materials of your home and it's releasing other toxins that are not mycotoxins. Those like VOCs, volatile
Right.
organic compounds, and other,
Yeah.
particulate. And we're finding these are also damaging to human health. So I just kind of put that in the
Compounding.
mycotoxicosis category, right? It's just a byproduct of the mold
Sure.
eating home. But these are all ways that mold could affect you, and maybe you're being affected in one way, maybe you're being affected in all three ways. And this is why it's important that you hire a mold literate doctor who knows more than just mold allergy, because the solution for mold allergy is either over-the-counter allergy medicines, prescriptive allergy medicines, or allergy shots, where they induce you, they inject you with low dose, low dose
Inoculate you.
amounts.
Yeah. Great.
And that's fine. I mean, you can do those things, but if you're living in mold and the mold is driving the illness, and you don't know it, this is where the long-term problems set in, because mold is a great mimicker. It mimics so many other conditions, from we've seen cases of rheumatoid. One of the first cases of mold toxicity in my office I ever saw 20 years ago was a school teacher. She was diagnosed with migraines and rheumatoid arthritis. And we changed her diet. And what happened was when she came to see me, her diet change coincided with the summertime. So she got better. We thought, oh, her diet's doing the great job and she's getting better. And then when school started again, she started becoming symptomatic and she tanked. And we found above her ceiling tile in her office, the vents, the AC vents, black growth on them. And, when we got her to approach the powers that be at the schoolhouse, they dismissed it all. And ultimately what happened was, we tested it. It was black mold. We got her out of the school. She quit her job, right? Ultimately, she had to quit her job. And
Sometimes it takes a really drastic, you know, change, right? And schools. I mean, you talked about military housing. Again, back to government contracts. Like schools are just a huge exposure risk. It's
Li-
definitely super common.
they shut down the air conditioning unit all summer. I mean,
Yeah.
if you live in a southern state, especially near the Gulf Coast, or any state for that matter, when you don't control humidity in an airtight building, and that humidity relatively goes up above 55%, welcome mold.
Right.
Mold is coming. It's just a matter of fact. I mean, mold needs water. The building itself is already mold food, no matter how you build it.
Yeah.
It is mold food. Mold can grow on really pretty much any substance. It prefers organic material because it can eat it more readily, but mold can grow on concrete. And, all you have to do is walk outside on a sunny day and look at that sidewalk. It's got mold on it. And if you take a power washer to it and you see how white it turns after you power wash it, it's because you just washed all the mold off of it.
Right.
So mold will grow on concrete in bright sunshine. UV lights don't stop it. You have to control the water. The humidity is the piece that when you're thinking about construction and building, that if you don't control for humidity, then you're not going to control for mold.
Yeah. It is so true. Sorry, I had to jump in because the schools are such a common exposure place. So I love that, even if you weren't aware early on, you were learning that before you finally embraced that this was part of the path you needed to take, was the deep dive in the mold world, and the mycotoxin world. So we've talked a little bit about, or a lot about, people who've already made good changes and haven't moved the needle. I'm guessing at this point, though, this is part of your assessment. If somebody walked into your clinic tomorrow presenting with autoimmune symptoms, including fatigue and whether they're labeled, not labeled. I tend to think sometimes of like chronic fatigue as and fibromyalgia as like we don't know why, right? Which is where you're like, yeah, think mold. I'm guessing you're not waiting 6 months and having people do all these changes that assessing for mold is part of your, pulling your lens back and really getting a good history and testing or not testing as far as what's going on.
I mean, testing is, I mean, I don't test everyone just because I usually
Right.
part of the history first.
Yeah.
If they're telling me, yeah, I've got this long exposure to water damage and yeah, I want to measure that. I want to definitely test for it. And if they're telling me, no, I don't suspect that at all, I'll start with other things. I mean, we start
Sure.
with what I spoke about earlier, food, chemicals, microbes, and nutritional deficits are going to be always the four categories of measurement to discern, trigger points for autoimmune disease because, autoimmunity is multifactorial. There's never one
Yeah.
trigger. It's always usually a dozen or more. So we measure those triggers in everyone. And then if we have a background of mold suspicion, we're going to definitely deep dive on mold too.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. So for listeners that are trained, they know this question is coming. What is one step, and this could be unrelated to mold if you want, it doesn't matter. Just one step that you feel that everybody can take starting today to support health. So it could be anything.
So there's six. What I call the six non-negotiable fundamentals of being healthy. And if you try to negotiate with these six things, you will lose and there will be a consequence. And the first is you have to eat real food. And you have to define what real food is to understand how to eat real food. Real food is not potato chips. Real food is not like going to the processed food and just because the bag says organic and whatnot, that's not necessarily real food. You've got to start with fundamentally eating real food. Number two, you got to go to bed and get good rest. Now, a
Yeah.
lot of people are like, well, I can't sleep. That's part of my problem. Well, we got to figure that out,
Right.
right? But sleep is a priority for health. It's a priority for healing and repairing. Number three, exercise is not negotiable. And exercise, you don't have to join a CrossFit gym or become a bodybuilder, but you
Okay.
need to be not sedentary and you
Yeah.
need to move weight. And when I say move weight, you don't have to lift heavy weight. Calisthenics, body weight is a great thing to move. Move your body.
Yeah.
And you need to master your body weight. You should be able to do a pull up and a push up and a sit up and a squat and a lunge. These are fundamental things. I mean, look at any young child that's relatively physically active can do all of these things. And only as adults do we lose the ability because we endeavor to be sedentary for many, many years and our body atrophies. When
Yeah.
your body atrophies, that means it's shrinking and your health is shrinking with it. Know that you need to move your body. Start where you can. You don't have to start with something you're not capable of. So if you can't do a push-up, then do a wall push-up. Or if you can't do a squat, sit against the wall and hold a half squat. Like there's a lot of different things you can do to kind of
Sure.
move your way into that. Number four, sunshine is required. Your body works off of photobiomodulation. Sunshine doesn't cause skin cancer. Sunburning does. It's just like water causes drowning. So quit drinking it. I mean, the medicine approach is just really backwards. We evolve in the sun. We require sun. There's UV light. There's red light. There's yellow and green light. There's all different types of wavelengths of light that have medicinal benefits in our bodies and are required by our bodies to function appropriately. So you've got to make sure that 20 minutes a day is not enough. Look, you've got to work on hours a day if you can. And so, you've got to arrange your schedule as if you want your life to be healthy. And so work on that. You also need number five, you need clean air. And this goes back to mold. If you've
Yeah.
got mold and mold toxins blowing through your air, you're going to have a problem. If you've got burning a bunch of chemically laden candles in your house, right? To make it smell nice, but you're breathing those chemicals in and they make estrogen and other hormones that are endocrine disrupting. Your health's going to suffer from that.
Yeah.
So clean air and then clean water would be number six.
Yeah.
And, if you live in any major metropolitan area, I live in the Houston area. There are 42 prescription drugs that we can measure in our drinking water after the city's done filtering it.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to involuntarily take 42 prescription microdoses every time you drink a cup of water, you have to filter your water. There's great filter devices that are relatively inexpensive, but you should be filtering your water and filtering your air. If you do those 6 things consistently and those things are top of mind, even if you're not perfect, you're going to improve your health. And those are all, for the most part, free. I mean, yeah, you might pay for an air filter and an air
But
filter. That part's not free. But sunshine is free.
yeah,
Cost you your time. Going to bed on time is free. Exercise is free. You don't need a gym membership. Just do calisthenics. You can do them.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to eat anyway. So not eating processed food is not costing you more than eating real food. Uh, at the end of the day, people will argue, well, organic food is more expensive than non-organic food. And it is, but it isn't more expensive in the sense that you're not going to pay a health bill that
Right.
bankrupts your family one day, or that you're not going to be an invalid that your children are now required to take care of you for the last 10 years because you can't remember their name and you put them all through such grief because you're demented. So your health is your responsibility. And those 6 things are part of, think of it as your blueprint to better health, and you should take them seriously because your life is at stake.
So well said. And so much of it is back to nature and compensating for living in the modern times. Really, like if we can just simplify it that way. Um, so you mentioned the documentary coming out, moldjack.com. People can go there. For people that are listening and they're on the go and they're not going to click the show notes, where's the best place to find more of you?
There's a couple of places. They could go to drpeterosborne.com, or they could go to my foundation, glutenfreesociety.org. If they want to get a bunch of free, fantastic information about diet, lifestyle change, and autoimmune disease, glutenfreesociety.org is where we house. I mean, there's thousands of articles and thousands of
Yeah.
free videos, tons of information that they can tap into that would help them navigate all these confusing issues.
And I know you're also really good at putting out content and showing up on social as well. So, just lots and lots of ways for people to just, get this incredible information that you're putting out. So appreciate your time, your wisdom, and the work that you're putting into helping us all get healthier.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate your sharing your platform to help me get this message out.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, remember you can get those links and transcripts by visiting inspiredliving.show. I hope you had a great time and enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to Julie Michelson's Inspired Living with Autoimmunity. Did you enjoy this episode? Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to get a transcript of this and every other episode, just head on over to inspiredliving.show or click on the link in this episode's description. There, you can also find everything we discussed in this episode, including links and information about our guest. You can even send in your questions to be answered by Julie in a future episode. That's inspiredliving.show. Until next time, this is Julie Michelson's Inspired Living with Autoimmunity podcast, helping you take your power back.